Good morning. This is Marshall Davis. Today we're going to look at Easter through the eyes of Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, that is. And in doing this, we're going to be looking at the 17th saying of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas. The first thing we notice when we read through the Gospel of Thomas is that there is no Easter narrative, no Easter story, no description of the resurrection of Jesus on Easter Sunday. That reveals how early the Gospel of Thomas is. The earliest canonical gospel, the Gospel of Mark, also has no resurrection account. A textual criticism of the Gospel of Mark reveals that an ending where the resurrection account was added to the Gospel of Mark later. But the earliest ending of Mark has no resurrection appearances. There's simply the empty tomb and an angel in there talking to the women. And the gospel originally ended with these words, "Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid." So that's it about Easter, silence, not even a repeating of the message that the angel gave about the resurrection. It says that the women said nothing to anyone about what they saw or about what the angel said. The Gospel of Thomas shares that silence about the resurrection. So does Q, which was the source for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This shows how early the Gospel of Thomas really is. The earliest approach of Thomas and Q were simply sayings by the historical Jesus. And then sometime later, narrative gospels were written, which included the resurrection stories. First, there was Mark, which included the story about the empty tomb and an angel saying that Jesus had risen, but no resurrection appearances. The earliest account of a resurrection appearance in the Bible is not found in the Gospels, actually, but in the writings of the Apostle Paul. In his famous resurrection chapter of 1 Corinthians, Paul gives the earliest account that we have of Easter appearances. And in that passage, he includes stories that we don't find in the Gospels. For example, he talks about Jesus appearing to James, the brother of Jesus, and to 500 people at one time. What a story that would be if we had the details about that in the Gospels, but we don't. Why is it not mentioned in the Gospels? Why was it left out? Paul says, then he appeared to James and to all the apostles, meaning more than just the 12 that I mentioned earlier in the list. And last of all, he appeared also to me as to one abnormally born. So this appearance to Paul is the earliest written account of the resurrection of Jesus, the resurrection appearance, and the only first-hand account that we have of a resurrection appearance. When the story of Jesus appearing to Paul is later told in the book of Acts, which was written later, we learn that it was not a bodily appearance. It was a spiritual appearance. Other people were present at the time that Paul says that he saw the risen Christ, but they didn't see anything. Paul makes it very clear in this chapter that the resurrection of Jesus was spiritual, not physical. Paul says, the body that is sown is perishable, it is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there's a natural body, there's also a spiritual body. So it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam, a life-giving spirit. I declare to you, brothers and sisters, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. So here, the earliest understanding of the resurrection of Jesus is that it was not flesh and blood. It was a visionary encounter, not a physical resuscitation of a corpse. Only later, as the first generation of believers died out, did the resurrection accounts, as they were repeated, as they then were written later on, become physical. This happened first in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and finally in the Gospel of John, which is the latest of the Gospels in the New Testament. And it has the most physical appearance of all. Now, I don't have the time to go into this in further detail here, but if you're interested, you can read my book on the topic entitled The Evolution of Easter: How the Historical Jesus Became the Risen Christ. And at some point, I also called this book, Did Jesus Really Rise from the Dead? I'm going to put a link to this book in the transcript and a description of this episode. Here, I simply want to point out that the resurrection of Jesus was not originally understood by the followers of Christ as physical. It evolved from spiritual visionary encounters to a physical bodily resurrection. The Apostle Thomas understood the resurrection as a spiritual experience. His gospel contrasted with the later approach that we find in the New Testament, in Matthew and in Luke. And by the time that the Gospel of John was being written, the physical theory of the resurrection had become dominant. Thomas's approach was seen as a threat. And so after Thomas's death, someone created the story that we now know as Doubting Thomas. The church came up with the famous story of Thomas converting to the idea of a bodily resurrection. According to John's Gospel, the Apostle Thomas was not present when the risen Christ appeared to the apostles. When Thomas heard about the resurrection, he said that he would not believe unless he saw it with his own eyes. He famously said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." So Thomas here is depicted as one who would not believe in the physical resurrection. So John's gospel in this story provides proof. The story says, a week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Thomas here became an example of a Christian who did not believe in the physical resurrection, but is convinced that it is real. In other words, he converted to the Orthodox view. In other words, again, the church rewrote history by creating its own narrative. But this is fake news, as they say, not good news. It is church disinformation fabricated to suppress the early message of the resurrection, the message of the Gospel of Thomas and others who held to this earliest understanding of the spiritual resurrection. And then later, it was suppressed even more by banning such books and burning such books as the Gospel of Thomas. This is where the 17th saying in the Gospel of Thomas comes in. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, I will give you what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, what no hand has touched, what has not arisen in the human heart. That is Thomas's view of the resurrection. The Gospel of John has a resurrection that the eye can see, and the hand can touch, and the ear can hear. The Jesus in John's Gospel says, stop doubting and believe. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, I will give you what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, what no hand has touched, and has not arisen in the human heart. What Jesus is talking about in the Gospel of Thomas is a mystical awareness of that which is beyond physical senses. So he's talking about the eternal Christ, the Logos, the Tao. This saying that Jesus gives here in the Gospel of Thomas is probably familiar to Christians because it is quoted in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, which is the same letter that contains the idea of the spiritual resurrection. In a chapter that talks about spiritual wisdom, Paul writes this: we do, however, speak a message of wisdom among the mature, but not the wisdom of this age or the rulers of this age who are coming to nothing. No, we declare God's wisdom, a mystery that has been hidden, and that God destined for our glory before time began. None of the rulers of this age understood it. For if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. However, it is written, what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, and what no human mind has conceived, the things God has prepared for those who love him. So Paul says it's written, and then he quotes this saying that we see on the lips of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas. So Paul, who is the earliest writings in the New Testament, is quoting the Gospel of Thomas. Of course, most Christians will not admit that. They say Paul was actually quoting from the book of Isaiah. But when you look up that passage that they point to in the book of Isaiah, it does not sound much like what Paul is quoting here. The saying in the Gospel of Thomas is a much better fit. And if Paul is not quoting Thomas, then both Paul and Thomas are quoting from another, even earlier source. In any case, this saying has to do with Easter. Easter is about the revelation of what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, what no human mind can conceive. Jesus says that this is what he offers us. And will give you what no eye has seen, what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, what no hand has touched, what has not arisen in the human heart. This is the Easter revelation. Call it resurrection if you want. Call it spiritual liberation from death. Call it spiritual awakening. Call it whatever you want. But it is Easter according to Thomas. And that is it for today. Grace and peace to you.